What do you think about this, Marion? Are you pleased to see them touring around hospitals in Australia?
I think they're a wonderful little couple.
Yeah.
I think, we should be very, very proud of our royals. I am a royalist, but I think, let them go. They're doing their duty. They're doing what they think is right. People always got somebody that's always one of the royals in trouble.
And the split with the King and with Prince William, and the fact that they are not really meant to be part of the royal family anymore, Marion, that doesn't bother you or worry you?
Yes, of course it bothers me. I think they should be in with the royals. I think that boy's worked really hard. He's like his mum in every way, and I think she was a wonderful lady, and let him get on with his life.
But getting on with your life isn't quite the same, is it, as having a sort of pretend royal tour that you say isn't a royal tour, and then getting paid to give speeches and have weekends while you're there. It's not quite the same as getting on with your life, is it?
Well, I think so. I think he's doing what he thinks is right, and that's my opinion anyway.
Let's get some sympathy from Margaret in Merseyside. Margaret, you're on their side.
Oh, yes, I am.
Tell me why. What you feel about it.
I think they're very unfairly treated. I mean, you've got the royal family banging on about how they're marvellous treating people with mental health issues.
Yeah.
And Meghan and Harry have both admitted they have mental health issues, and they throw them under the bus.
But how do you think they were thrown under the bus when it was Meghan and Harry who decided to leave and to make the break?
I think they had no alternative. They had no choice. They were getting treated so badly.
So you really feel for them. So when you see them touring, you think, well, good for you, and
I do, yes.
Yeah.
And they've got to make money somehow.
Right.
And no one else is going to give it them like the rest of them get.
Okay, so you're absolutely with them. We're certainly not getting much criticism for them. If we're taking the temperature here, people are well behind them. It's interesting,
let's not forget, it was the British media that drove them to the point of wanting to leave. When you just look at a montage of, there are a couple of specific papers, but when you look at a montage of their front pages, they were pretty much on those front pages 3 days a week, and it was remorselessly negative.
So you just watched that clip. And honestly, if you felt even a tiny shift in energy, you're not imagining it. Something very interesting is happening here. Because what we just saw wasn't just another panel discussion about Harry and Meghan. It was something the British media really doesn't like to deal with. The public speaking for themselves and not following the script. And suddenly, everything gets a little awkward. Because for years now, we've been told this very neat, very controlled narrative about Prince Harry and Meghan, that they're divisive, that they're unpopular, that they're somehow the problem, that they walked away for selfish reasons, that they're constantly seeking attention, that they're the villains in a story that the media has carefully curated. But then you get moments like this, where actual members of the public call in, completely unfiltered, and just calmly dismantle that entire narrative in real time. No shouting, no drama, no agenda, just common sense. And you could feel it in the room, that subtle shift, that tension when the expected talking points don't land the way they're supposed to. Because Marion didn't come in angry, she didn't come in aggressive. She came in with something far more dangerous. Sincerity. Saying they're a wonderful couple. Saying Harry is like his mother. Saying, let him live his life. That's not a controversial take. That's a human one. And that's what makes it so powerful. Because how do you argue with that without looking completely unreasonable? You can't. And then Margaret steps in, and suddenly we're not just talking about admiration anymore, we're talking about accountability. She brings up mental health, and that's where things get really uncomfortable for the establishment narrative. Because let's be honest here, the royal family has spent years positioning itself as supportive of mental health causes. Campaigns, speeches, awareness initiatives, all of that. And on the surface, that's a good thing. Nobody's arguing against that. But then you have Harry and Meghan, two people who openly admitted they were struggling, who spoke about real issues, who didn't package it neatly or make it palatable. And instead of support, what did they get? Relentless scrutiny, mockery, dismissal, headlines questioning their credibility, endless debates about whether their experiences were valid enough. So when Margaret says they were thrown under the bus, it lands because people have seen it. They've watched it unfold in real time. This isn't some abstract claim. This is something that's been playing out in front of millions of people for years. And that's the thing the media underestimates. They assume the audience isn't paying attention. They assume people will just absorb whatever narrative is presented and move on. But people remember. They remember the headlines. They remember the tone. They remember how different the treatment was compared to others. And then David Grant comes in and says what really needed to be said. The media coverage itself, the sheer volume of it, the consistency of it, the negativity of it. 3 days a week on front pages. Think about that for a second. That's not occasional criticism. That's not balanced reporting. That's saturation. At that point, it stops being about informing the public and starts looking like something else entirely, something closer to obsession. And once that idea clicks in people's minds, it's very hard to unsee. Because suddenly, every headline looks different. Every story feels repetitive. Every exclusive starts to blur into the same pattern. And that's exactly why this clip matters. Not because it's loud or dramatic, but because it quietly exposes the gap between what the media says people think and what people are actually starting to say for themselves. And you could see the discomfort from the hosts, that moment where they realize the conversation isn't going where they expected it to go. Because these shows rely on a certain rhythm, a certain predictability, a balance where opposing views are presented but ultimately contained. But when real public sentiment comes through, especially when it challenges the dominant narrative, that balance gets shaky.
And suddenly, it's not as easy to steer the conversation. And let's talk about timing for a second, because this is all happening while Harry and Meghan are on their Australian visit. A visit that, by all visible accounts, is going incredibly well. Crowds showing up, engagements being received positively, people connecting with them, real interactions, not just staged appearances. And yet, back in the UK media space, there's this parallel narrative trying to downplay it, trying to suggest muted reactions, trying to frame it as underwhelming. It's almost like two completely different realities are being presented at the same time. One that people can see with their own eyes, and one that's being told to them. And clips like this start to bridge that gap. Because when everyday callers are echoing what people are actually observing, it becomes harder to maintain that disconnect. You can only tell people something isn't happening for so long before they start questioning why you're saying it. And that's where we are now. There's a growing awareness, a shift in how people are consuming this kind of coverage, less blind acceptance, more scrutiny. And it doesn't mean everyone suddenly agrees on everything. That's not how this works. But it does mean the conversation is opening up in a way that it hasn't before. And for Harry and Meghan, that matters. Because for a long time, their story has been told about them, rather than by them, or by people who actually relate to their experiences. But now, you're starting to hear more voices like Marian's, like Margaret's, like David Grant's. Voices that aren't polished or media-trained or tied to an agenda. Just people speaking plainly. And that's powerful in a way that's hard to manufacture. Because authenticity cuts through noise. And let's be real for a moment. The reaction from certain parts of the media isn't just disagreement, it's frustration. Because the usual tactics aren't landing the same way. The exaggerations feel more obvious. The contradictions are easier to spot. The overexposure of certain narratives is starting to backfire. And when that happens, the tone often shifts from confident to defensive. You start seeing more insistence, more repetition, more attempts to reinforce the same points. But repetition doesn't make something true. It just makes it louder. And audiences are getting better at recognizing that. That's why this clip feels different. It's not just another debate, it's a moment where the script slips a little, where the expected chorus turns into something more unpredictable. And honestly, it's refreshing, because for once, the conversation isn't dominated by outrage or sensationalism. It's grounded in something much simpler: fairness. The idea that people should be treated fairly, that their experiences should be taken seriously, that criticism should be balanced, not relentless. It's not a radical concept, but in certain media spaces it almost feels like one. And that says a lot. Now, none of this means the media is going to suddenly change overnight. Let's not get carried away. These systems are deeply entrenched. Narratives don't just disappear because a few callers challenge them. But what it does mean is that cracks are showing. And once cracks appear, they tend to spread. Because more people start speaking up. More perspectives get shared. More moments like this happen. And over time, that builds into something bigger. A shift. Not necessarily dramatic, not necessarily immediate, but real. And you can already see the early signs of it in the way discussions are evolving, in the way audiences are reacting, in the way certain narratives are being questioned instead of accepted. And for Harry and Meghan, that shift couldn't come at a more interesting time. Because while the media continues to circle around them, analyze them, critique them, they're out there doing the work, engaging with communities, showing up, building something beyond the headlines. And whether people support them or not, that contrast is becoming harder to ignore. The noise versus the reality. And clips like this help highlight that difference. They remind people that there's more than one perspective, that the loudest voices aren't always the most representative ones. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the real change starts. Not with grand statements or dramatic confrontations, but with small, steady moments of honesty. Like a caller saying, "Let him get on with his life." Simple, direct, human. And somehow, in that studio, in that moment, that was the most disruptive thing of all. What's also quietly fascinating here is how these callers didn't sound like people who live online dissecting every royal headline. They sounded like people who have simply observed over time how this story has been told and retold. There's a difference between being emotionally reactive and being quietly fed up. And what you heard in those voices was the second one. That kind of sentiment doesn't come from one headline or one interview. It builds slowly, like someone noticing the same pattern over and over again until it becomes impossible to ignore. And when that realization hits, it's not loud or dramatic, it's steady and firm. That's the kind of public opinion that doesn't flip back easily because it's rooted in long-term observation, not momentary outrage. Another layer that makes this moment hit harder is the generational tone shift you can almost feel creeping in. The old style of royal commentary, where everything is framed in rigid loyalty and unquestioned tradition, doesn't land the same way with everyone anymore. People are more willing to separate the idea of an institution from the individuals within it. They're more open to saying, this part works, this part doesn't, instead of blindly defending everything under one banner. And when Harry and Meghan's situation gets discussed through that lens, it stops being about rebellion or disrespect and starts looking more like a personal decision in response to very public pressure. That shift in perspective is subtle, but it's powerful because it changes the entire foundation of the argument. And then there's the simple reality that moments like this expose something the media rarely wants to admit. Control over the narrative isn't as tight as it used to be. You can frame a story a certain way, repeat it, amplify it, bring in guests who echo it, but the second real, unscripted voices enter the conversation, that control weakens because authenticity has a way of cutting through even the most polished messaging. Those callers weren't trying to win a debate or score points. They were just speaking plainly, and that's exactly why it landed. It reminds people watching that they're not alone in thinking differently. And once that feeling spreads, it becomes a lot harder for any single narrative to dominate the conversation the way it once did. There's also something deeply ironic about how these discussions keep circling around Harry and Meghan as if they're fading into irrelevance, while at the exact same time, they're still the main topic of conversation. You can't spend this much airtime dissecting people and then convincingly argue they don't matter. It doesn't work like that. The obsession gives the game away. If they were truly insignificant, the coverage would dry up, the panels would move on, the energy would shift elsewhere. But it doesn't. And moments like this highlight that contradiction in the most unintentional way. The more the media tries to minimize them, the more it ends up proving the opposite through sheer volume of attention. And then there's the emotional undercurrent that nobody on those panels ever quite wants to sit with for too long because it complicates the narrative. When people defend Harry, especially, it often comes from a place that goes beyond headlines and into memory. People remember him as the young boy walking behind his mother's coffin, growing up under relentless scrutiny, trying to carve out some kind of normal life in a very abnormal situation. So when callers say things like, he's like his mum, or let him live his life, it's not just casual commentary, it's empathy that's been building for years. And that kind of emotional connection doesn't disappear just because the media decides to shift tone. If anything, trying to push against it too aggressively tends to strengthen it, because people don't like being told to ignore what they can clearly feel and remember.